Okay, so we're going to get the show rolling. Thank you all for coming out on a Saturday afternoon. I know today's event is going to be historic. I can just imagine in the future I was having a conversation many years down the line when people are trying to find out the state of development economics, what we today were thinking. I'm sure all the videos will have all of that recorded. My name is Yao Nyako. I'm a professor of economics here at New York University. And with my colleagues Rajiv Dehejia and Bill Easterly, we run the Development Research Institute, which is happy to help run today's activity. I am going to introduce somebody here quickly to give some remarks, but I just can't resist saying, ever since I was a graduate student, the two people who are up here are just, I went to Cornell, had some Indian professors, famous professors. I got there, and they said to me, they told me that for them, deity was, one of the professors here, I'll let you take your guess. And I thought my advisors were deities. So just imagine, deity upon deity, okay? And he's here today, so it's just been wonderful. And the other person who is going to be speaking, I won't mention names, has just been a great mentor of mine and has just been so helpful, again, since my graduate school days. And so I'm just excited to be here. I will just say everything we do at the Development Research Institute is funded through the university very, very generously, the provost office in particular. And we have a wonderful person, a professor, somebody who has been supporting us and been through many, many, many of our events, and who has just been making sure that anytime we need something at the Development Research Institute, we get support at the very, very, very highest levels of the university. So please, a big round of applause for the Deputy Provost of New York University, Sibel Raver, please.
Hi, everyone. I am indeed Sibel Raver. That was extremely generous introduction. I do serve as the Deputy Provost of the university, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to welcome you all here today, both on my own behalf, but also on behalf of President Hamilton and Provost Fleming. As Provost Fleming has said many times, New York University has immense strengths in the social sciences across a wide number of disciplines and across numbers of schools and centers and institutes. And to showcase these strengths, she and our Dean of the Social Science Division of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, David Stasavich, are leading and launching a new event series of which this is one part. So thank you so much, David, for launching this series and organizing this event with a number of other leaders with whom I think this wouldn't be possible. Chief among those is Professor Yao Nyarko and his colleagues Bill Easterly and Rajiv Dehejia from NYU's Development Research Institute. The support of DRI is in line with the university's commitment to the social sciences, particularly as it affects the developing world as well as developed countries, specifically also in thinking about having a positive impact on the lives of the poor who benefit from high-quality economic research applied to the problems of world poverty. Thanks also to the CV Star Center for Applied Economics, which is an independent research nonprofit housed within the Department of Economics at New York University. We really are very grateful to CV Star for funding this conference. And we also want to thank the Annual Review of Economics for providing significant support for today's conversation, specifically with Tim Bresley in taking the lead on that. Tim Bresley is to be also very much appreciated. He's from the London School of Economics, and will be chairing the conversation as editorial committee member of the Annual Review of Economics. He's played a really key role, primarily in bringing the idea of hosting this conversation at NYU with DRI. So thank you, Tim, for working with us on this. It is also, of course, my great pleasure to welcome our two esteemed speakers, both of whom are Nobel laureates. I will mention briefly, before saying their names, we actually have 4 Nobel laureates with us today. So I want to thank, in addition to Sir Angus Deaton, the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, where he's been teaching for 30 years. We also have Amartya Sen, the Thomas W. Lamont University Professor and Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University, and until 2004, the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. So we are so deeply excited to have both of those speakers, and again, to have Professors Kahneman and Professor Romer in the audience, as well as, of course, many other of you who have also been major prize winners and leaders, and indeed, as the next generation of students among us will, we hope that they will be. Before I turn it over to Professor Besley, I just wanted to mention the extent to which these two speakers and their disciplines have so profoundly transformed my own work and the work of my colleagues. I'm a behavioral social scientist by training in psychology and public policy. Before I joined NYU, I was actually on faculty at the University of Chicago in a department that had 17 economists. And for me, that was really an eye-opener, something that was quite new in terms of interdisciplinary work. My colleagues had the same levels of dedication to studying poverty and inequality that I did, and yet they held to a position that their work was value neutral. And that was kind of a shock to me. I thought, how could your work be value neutral? I soon came to understand that what my colleagues meant was not that there were no values in their models or methods in choosing which variables to include and choosing which questions to ask and choosing which methods to use, but that they made key choices on ways to reduce the value-laden complexity of our discussions, to reduce mathematical forms. My favorite phrase that an economist friend would say when he didn't like something that I was working on or he wasn't satisfied with one of my analyses was that the perspective that I was taking, that my model essentially was misspecified. And I love that. It was such a tight, quaint way of disagreeing with me. You know, rather than saying I was completely wrong or I'd gone off the deep end, he would quietly say, your model is misspecified. And what he was really saying was that I needed to take a second look, that I needed to think through what I might have left out, mechanisms that I may have gotten wrong, an underlying framework with which I was working that may have not been sufficiently developed or might need work. And I really think that's a tremendous example or a model for how we, in a very intensely, hotly debated intellectual space around issues that are of key concern, can actually bring the heat and light down enough to actually understand the problem in ways that we can continue to discuss by thinking about how are we specifying the problem. I'm grateful to those economics friends, but also, and more importantly, to these two intellectual giants of our generation for pressing us to use both intellectual and mathematic precision when trying to tackle issues of such moral weight as poverty, inequality, and human welfare. And in that moment of specifying our models, we specify what matters most. This university, our president and our provost, as well as the esteemed leaders of our faculty who've made this event come together, are clearly telling us what matters most, aligning precision and rigor with value and depth and significance for the problems that we tackle, including these issues of inequality, poverty, and welfare. So thank you so much to both of you, to all three of you really, in pointing us in this direction, in showing us not just the market value of the work that we do or the intellectual value of the work that we do, but the social value of the work that we do in thinking about the world and making it a better place through our intellectual effort. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tim Besley. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you very much, Sibel, and thank you very much to NYU for making this event possible. My main role today is to keep order in the event that the panel gets out of control. I'm sure it won't happen. I'm standing here principally because I'm a member of the editorial committee of the annual reviews of economics, and we decided at our last editorial meeting to try and bring together Angus and Amartya to have the conversation that we're having today. I have to say, even though I thought it was a wonderful idea, I was skeptical even in my own mind that I'd be able to pull it off, but with the help of NYU, we've done so. The Annual Review of Economics is a relatively new member of the Annual Review Stables, which has a very wide range of subjects and covered. I think the reason it got off the ground so successfully was mostly to do with the efforts of Ken Arrow. Ken was the very first editor who I think Sam Gubbins, who's in the audience today, approached when the Annual Review of Economics was launched. And I'm a second-generation editorial board member, and like many before me, having a letter from Ken inviting you to join the board was sufficient to reply within about 5 minutes that one was going to do it, in spite of having any number of existing commitments. And it has been a remarkable success, and I think we owe a great debt of thanks to Ken for that. I'm not going to spend much time further introducing Angus and Amartya, but both have been very special figures in my life and mentors, and I met them both when I was a graduate student. And if you'd said to me then that I'd be standing here now, more than 30 years later, introducing them in this context, I think I wouldn't have believed you. But it is wonderful we have them here. I'm just going to highlight 3 things that they have in common. They both were educated at Cambridge. They both, as already been mentioned, are Nobel laureates. But I think more importantly, they're both deeply committed to making economics a subject that speaks to fundamental real-world questions of really substantive importance. And that shouldn't be stressed, it can't be stressed enough, because it's people like Amartya and Angus who keep economics close to the kinds of things which I think the discipline was founded to study. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Angus, who is going to begin the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Sounds like these microphones are working. Just one little thing about the ground rules. Tim is trying very much to stay in the background and to pretend to only be the chair of this thing. But I'm hoping we'll have a much more 3-way conversation than 2-way conversation.
May I second that?
Okay. Also, when I agreed to do this, I thought, well, I'll go back and read what Amartya Sen has written. And, I found a very dated Vita. And when I got past the first 26 books, I thought, okay, we're going to need a team to do this, or a village, perhaps. I'm hoping Tim will pile in as we go. Just a little bit about our relationship to Amartya. Neither of us were students of Amartya in the sense that he did not supervise our dissertations, though Tim tells me that Amartya was formerly his moral tutor or something of the sort in Oxford for a brief...
Not quite that moral.
but maybe tutor in morals rather than moral tutor. But Amartya did not advise him, nor did Amartya advise me. So neither of us are standing here as Amartya's pupils in the usual academic sense. However, for both of us, Amartya's writing has been absolutely crucial in influencing us at very many points in our career. I think I met Amartya first in 1969, which is almost half a century ago. And even though we've worked on different things for most of our lives, that cross-influence has just been incredibly important to me, as it has been for Tim. And I think that's true of many of our generation, especially in Britain, and of some of the generation before. I'm thinking of people like Tony Atkinson, Nick Stern, and Jim Merles, who died very recently, sadly. Okay, so to get into the substance, let's start. Tim talked about Ken Arrow and his role in starting the annual reviews in economics. And I heard you about a year ago explain how you and Shukamoy Chakravarti, as students at Presidency College in Calcutta, who heard that Arrow had written this book, Social Choice and Individual Values, you couldn't afford to buy it because you were penniless students, but you got a bookseller of Calcutta to lend you a copy, provided you promised to keep it clean. And that sort of launched your career or your interest in social choice theory. And I think Arrow has been a very important influence on your life ever since.
Oh, totally, yeah. No, that was my first year in Calcutta, Presidency College. I had just come from my school in Santo Niketan. And Sukumar Chakravarti is not remembered that much now, but he was very extraordinarily gifted guy. And we had a system whereby we go to the local bookshop and they would lend us this book for a day, covering with an old newspaper so that we didn't soil the cover, you know, which was a very generous thing to do. I think the most important book that I read under that rubric was Kennaro's. Actually, that was about 6 months after the book came out, so it's pretty early. And I remember sitting down with Sukumar about why does the proof work and could it be shortened? Now we know, of course, that it could be very much shortened. But it really, for me, it really just had a profound impact. Another book which is not connected with Ken's, which I had a huge influence on me, was Ken Galway's book called American Capitalism. Because we were all, both Sukumar and I were lefties, as it were. And one of the things that, I mean, when I look back and think about contributions to my thinking, and I do want to come back to Kennaro because no one compares in terms of influence on me than with Ken. But Marx was a big influence too, rather earlier than Kennaro. But there was something totally missing there, I thought, when I first read it. So, namely politics. I mean, one doesn't think of Marx being apolitical, but he was basically uninterested in politics, I think. Because if he were interested in politics, he would talk about or think about how you keep people in check. I mean, you can't think of a balmier idea than dictatorship of the proletariat. It means absolutely damn all. And at the same time, I was getting a huge amount from Marx, many of those things that, idea of objective illusion, which, he was talking about as false consciousness, the idea that needs and desserts are very different things. This is critique of Gotha program, and that to confuse them would be a mistake, and a theory of justice could get off from either end, and so on. But there was this lack of understanding or interest in, I would say understanding is probably the wrong word, interest in politics, really, that somehow you get the good people to come there and they're going to govern things well. And it's really, I think, Ken Galbraith's American Capitalism, which in a sense is a huge praise of capitalism, which had quite a profound understanding of it. That book I was lent for 4 hours. And I was trying to finish it in a coffee house. And I was reading it and trying to explain to the coffee house manager that 1 cup of coffee was sufficient to sit there for 4 hours and read this book, because I didn't have more money than that. But I wanted to read it there. The light was very good, and so forth. And so I think that was I'm so glad that Angus brought this up. I mean, those were very formative periods in me, in my thought. I think it influenced my friend, but it really devastated me in terms of, I had thought about there being groups, and in a vague way, partly connected with maths of sets and so on, I was concerned about how could you say that this is what the group wants? And that had bothered me, and it seemed ostensibly, to start with, as if Ken Arrow was saying that you couldn't. But that is not what you were saying, of course. And I think it's in the very Hegelian, if I may say, negation of negation. It is trying to dispute that understanding of Ken, that it became clear to me what I ought to do. Remember, I was first year undergraduate, and first year in Calcutta, I mean, really pretty young. I mean, I think I was 17 or something like that. And then, of course, I arrived in Cambridge, and absolutely no one took an interest in it. And some were hostile. John Robinson was totally hostile. Richard Kahn was totally hostile. Nicky Caldo was what he normally did, namely encourage you on grounds that a certain amount of folly in your life is necessary for your character building. The only one who took an interest was, oddly enough, a Marxist, namely Maurice Dobb. And he took quite a lot of interest in it. He was the only one who taught welfare economics in the class. And indeed, a number of the fellow left-wingers, like Bob Rawson, I can think of, regarded that to be a great mistake on Maurice Dobb's part. But he wanted me to explain the theorem and why it was interesting and so forth. And the other was also a semi-Marxist, namely Piero Sraffa. And then we talked about, he was having a debate at that time with Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, the founder of the Communist Party, the great intellectual, the founder of the L'Ordine Nuovo, which I remember Bob Silvers once telling me that if the New York Review reaches that level as L'Ordine Nuovo, then he would be very pleased. Which is really, I can't think of a higher compliment coming from somebody like Robert Silvers running the New York Review at its heyday. But he was telling me, Sraffa was telling me, I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of time.
That's all right. It's your memoirs we're talking about here, not mine. But,
no, the idea was going to be fair.
No, and I think it's terrific for this audience because these names, you know, John Robinson is probably known to many people here, but many of these others would not, like Maurice Dobb, who was regarded as sort of rather unsound in spite of being a Marxist. He was rather on the right.
Yes, indeed, yeah. In fact, that's right, because and when he first moved to Trinity, I couldn't resist that now that Angus made that. You know, he was a member of the British Communist Party already. And Dennis Robertson, who always described himself as a liberal, but in fact was conservative, and he offered him a job. And Morris accepted it immediately. He was then a research student at Pembroke College. And then he went home, and being a good Englishman, he wondered, shouldn't I have mentioned that I'm a member of the Communist Party? And then he wrote a letter of apology. I think specifically English virtue I can think of, namely writing saying that when you offered me a job, this job, I was so overwhelmed with the good prospect of becoming a teacher in Trinity that I overlooked to tell you, for which I apologize, that I'm a member of the British Communist Party. And if after knowing that, you decide that you want to withdraw your offer of my teaching Trinity undergraduates, I would like you to know that I would not hold that against you. First I heard this story from Sraffa and then later on Dobb. And Sraffa at the end said, that was the damn stupid letter that Morris wrote. And then he got a reply from Dennis Robertson saying, Dear Dobb, so long as you give us a fortnight's notice before blowing up the chapel, it will be all right. So anyway, he took an interest, and I think he was actually much broader than that. But Schaeffer was debating the fact that Gramsci, from whom Schaeffer got a lot, and we may or may not get to it, but I believe that he had a profound influence on Anglo-American philosophy, namely Wittgenstein's conversion from the early phase of Tractatus with rules and regulations about language use and to philosophical investigation, namely finding out what makes communication possible. There are rules, but these are rules that emerge from a public discussion, almost an anthropological view, as Wittgenstein himself described of language. So it was a big figure, but Gramsci took the view, like many Marxists do, that bourgeois liberty is not important. And Schaeffer wrote a long letter. Then I later on see it, we have it in Trinity and Wren Library, but he told me first orally that saying to Gramsci, saying that beautiful or ugly, likable or not, bourgeois liberty, which you decry, is the thing that Italian, this is the fascist period, Italian proletariat needs over everything else. Any other conquest, and I'm quoting the language, that the proletariat wishes to make has to bring on that solid basis of accepting what you call bourgeois liberty. Yeah. Now, of course, this had a profound connection with social choice theory. My own work was very much connected, well, part of my work with liberty and how to accommodate it. So all this was going on at that time, but I think I should not have taken a lot of liberty.
I want to come back to that, but yeah. Could we say a little bit about John Robinson? I mean, you showed up in Cambridge as a graduate student at the age of 19, and John Robinson actually supervised your thesis, right, on the choice of techniques. I read you wrote about her. She was totally brilliant, but vigorously intolerant, right? Which, given how gentle you usually are very strong words, right? Do you want to talk a little bit more about her? I mean, she's often regarded as, you know, the most distinguished woman in economics who should have gotten the Nobel Prize, who never did. I get the sense she didn't have much lasting influence on you, that she derailed you into writing a thesis on something you weren't particularly interested in.
Right.
But maybe that's not true.
That's absolutely true. I don't know how to describe a person other than vigorously intolerant. When she told me as my supervisor that I read the first chapter, and it's the kind of thing that will be praised by established economists. And you would have no difficulty getting your PhD. You know, Cambridge, your supervisor is not one of your examiners, unlike in America. Right. So she said, I'm not going to read the rest of your thesis. And I said, but you're supposed to say that it can be submitted for PhD. And he said, I will say it. So I said, on what basis? On the basis of having read chapter 1. And it's 8 chapters, by the way. Okay. And he said, it's good, clearly, it's good in the way that these people understand it. And, I mean, it's not worthy of you. And someday you have to promise me you have to come back to real economics. I don't know whether vigorously not, intolerant, certainly. I had an odd relationship with him because I liked him very much. He was very kind to me. great interest in my personal life. When my first marriage broke up, she commanded me with a letter to come and see her and told me not to. And I didn't say, none of your business. She said it's a bad thing. Once you have children, and we did have 2 children, it's very unkind to the children. And in a sense, she was describing her own life, really, and which she didn't, and wake up. But she remained very kind to me throughout. Knew that I didn't think much of it economics. You see, it began. My first year, she was not my supervisor. Second year, I had both Morris Dobb and John Robinson. And John told me that she just finished this book called Accumulation of Capital, that if I liked, instead of my writing essays for her, I could read 1 chapter of her book and discuss it. Which I did, which seemed an easier way of spending time. And I did. And I also, I don't think I quite used that expression, but I also told her why I didn't like the book, basically, why I don't think so. And there was also, in a sense, she thought that, I mean, her view of left and right was very peculiar. And I think she was saying that by not taking interest in that and taking interest in such things as welfare economics and social choice theory, I was showing myself to be unsympathetic to the working classes instead of having all this capital theory thing. And I remember one occasion trying to tell her that, I mean, if there is a downfall of capitalism, it won't be because of some subtle mistake in capital theory. It will be because of, to quote Figu, and that upset her very much, because of the mean streets and hallowed life that capitalism makes us lead. I don't think she understood that at all. And she thought it was all connected with this, something whether capital could be seen as a factor of production or not. And so, I was completely out of tune and with her. And Albi, I mean, he was in many ways almost the same as in terms of their role vis-a-vis me formally as Morris Dobb and Theo Schaeffer, who were my teachers also. But and even though we disagreed, we argued, but this continued. It was a continuous relationship. In her case, there was a kind of breakup. And she took a position which actually is very common, became very common in India now, but not coming from the left, but from the right, that what you have to concentrate on is economic growth. Once you have grown and become rich, then you can do healthcare, education, all this stuff, which I think is the most profound error that you can make. And that was Joan's position. And in fact, she criticized Sri Lanka for offering highly subsidized food to everyone on nutritional grounds. And I remember the phrase she used, the sentence was, Sri Lanka is trying to taste the fruit of the tree without growing it.
Yeah. This is remarkable as you talk because, I came there much later than you did, but those were very powerful personalities, all of these people. When anyone goes into graduate school, they usually have no idea what they want, and they're reshaped by the people around them, which is why people try to go to really good graduate school. But you really, in some sense, came out as you went in, which is a fairly remarkable thing. I mean, you thought about welfare economics, you thought about social well-being, They were interested in production,
Yeah.
you know, and it didn't really move you at all. I mean, you obviously absorbed a lot from it.
Yeah, it is actually, I was very lucky, I think, in that respect. And I have to say, to give credit where it's due, I had support from the fact that I had on one side people whose politics were similar to mine, namely very left, namely Morris Dahl and Theo Schaffer.
Right.
And also, on the other side, there was Figou. And it seemed to me that, I mean, there was a guy talking about inequality as Tony Atkinson recognizes. You know, the Atkinson measure was inspired by Figou. He talks about poverty. I already quoted his definition of economics. He talks about the environment and the pollution and so on. And there seems really wonderful economics. And I was told that he was a right-wing economist because he didn't agree with John Maynard Keynes about the causes of unemployment. In fact, when I went to Stockholm after this Nobel stuff, they asked me in the interview saying, what's your position about some macroeconomy? I said, I don't do macroeconomy. I don't actually, I've never done it, and I took the liberty of quoting a common friend of ours, namely Frank Kahn, namely that the subject doesn't exist. Because macro must be the totality of micro things. And so that didn't go down well in Stockholm. But they did ask me, but surely on Keynes versus Figou, you're on the Keynes side. So I said on the unemployment issue I may well be, but if I compare an economist like Keynes, who never took an interest in inequality, on poverty, on the environment, and Figou, who took interest in all of them, I don't think I will be able to say exactly what you are asking me to say. So I think I was lucky in this. I think Figou helped me a lot. And that way, actually, the person who helped me with Figou was Dennis Robertson, who was he was a big figure in my life, though we disagreed, but we agreed on something. We agreed on utility and interpersonal comparison being okay. And I had a very close relation with him, and I remember my last dinner with him, which was at David Campernaum's place. I was going to India for a month. When I came back, he was dead. But in that, he said, do you know, Amartya, that no one knows the right tune of the owl and the pussycat. My great-grandmother taught me that. And I said, I want to hear it. And David Campernaum joined me in demanding that, and he sang. And that was, at the end of it, he said, well, when I'm dead, no one will know the correct tune and the pussycat. And that was my last thing, and then 2 days later I went to India, and when I was coming back, I still remember the occasion. I was nearly missing a train in I think King's Cross or Liverpool Street, I can't remember. I ran and got into it, and Michael Posner was in the compartment. He said, did I know that Dennis Robertson had died? Mm-hmm. And I must say I felt total grief not that of a student, because I don't think, unlike from Darwin Trafford, he wasn't my teacher really, but as a friend, even though he was quite elderly, which means a bit younger than what I am now. And I was less than half his age, I think. Very nostalgic to think about these, Angus.
Well, he's a name that I imagine very few economists would be able to tell you anything about today.
Dan Silverton, yeah.
I'd like to go back a little bit further even.
Yeah.
So, in your childhood in India, you lived through a very traumatic period of Indian history. You saw communal violence. You've written about murder, communal murder.
Yeah.
You lived through the Bengal famine. You lived through the partition of Bengal. You had a very serious medical problem of your own, which very nearly killed you.
Yeah.
All of these experiences have echoes in your work, or I certainly think they do. And particularly its very broad perspective in thinking about human well-being beyond its material basis. Maybe we'll pick up these things as we go, but would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, they were kind of, two of them were devastating experience. The cancer I regard as a victory.
Yes.
Since I was given 15% chance of living 5 years, and that was 67 years ago or something like that, I think I did all right on that one. But the Bengal famine, the striking thing was, of course, the economics of it is what I first looked at, namely that it's the last famine in India, 4 years before the empire ended, and it was really completely avoidable famine, and basically I had figured out in my own mind that the problem was not that the British had the wrong figure, because they were claiming that there was so much food in Bengal that there couldn't be a famine. And it's true, Bengal had quite a lot of food, but that's supply, there's also demand. And that is the time when the Japanese were at the border of Burma and India. In fact, a part of the Japanese army was in India, in Imphal. And the armies were moving in, the British Indian Army as well as the British Army, and later the American, all coming in. They're consuming a lot. Airdromes being constructed. No matter what theory you take, effective demand or money supply, all of them give you similar prediction that the prices will rise. And people don't live on the fact that there is food. They live on the fact that they can buy the food. So that was the thing. And actually the idea wasn't original to me at all. The Bengali papers were all writing this, but the Bengali papers were banned, the daily papers. All you could do were these monthly magazines, which my grandmother used to read, and I was reading. I was between 9 and 10 at that time. I was very interested in what was going on. And later, 30 years later, when I did some work on it, I kept on telling me that I read them somewhere before, what I was trying to say. But I read them in these magazines. because they were saying roughly the same thing. So later on, when my book came out, some of my friends went on saying this is not original, people knew it. And my claim was to say that's exactly what I'm saying. It's not original. It has been known. The point is that it has not been used or practiced. And the really interesting, I mean, when this famine broke and the Raj went on, we had originally a very bad viceroy, totally unsympathetic, called Linlithgow, who was from the same region as the only person for whom I take some credit in trying to influence British politics. Namely, he came from Tamdale's country. When I first met Tamdale, he was the president of the Tory club. And I had argued and argued and argued, and his faith was coming down anyway. And then he left the Tory party, joined Labour, became in some ways left-wing Labour, at least in some issues. But that is the Linlithgow country. But he never took any interest at all in this. And there was a big difference when it was towards the end of the famine, when Wavell came in. I mean, his very first day, he writes his note saying, I ought to go to Bengal. And he makes a slight comment on that Linlithgow not having been there, despite 2 years of famine there, and so on. And of course, it was also the Brits were in a great dilemma, and it took me to a political aspect of my work, namely Statesman, which was a very good paper, excellent paper. And the editor of it was Ian Stevens, who was I came to know him later well, because he was a fellow of King's when I was a young fellow, a young student at Cambridge. But he was the editor of that in that great Statesman house which still exists. And the Brits did not censor this English-owned paper, but appealed to the English-owned paper that for the sake of the war, it is important that nothing about the famine be discussed. So while people were dying, the Statesman did not publish anything. Ultimately, one day, and I even know which day it was, it's 16th of August, 15th of August, 16th was the editorial, 15th of August, 1943, that Ian Stevens said that he's just betraying his profession. He's a journalist, he's not writing it, and he said he couldn't live with that. So on the 16th of August and the 18th of August came vitriolic attack on the British Empire's policy on famine. And India didn't have a parliament, but Britain did. But the British Parliament had not discussed this because the information was totally lacking, similar to what would happen. I don't want to go into that now, we might later. The Chinese famine, when 30 million people died, Beijing didn't know very much about it. Now here the Westminster didn't know very much about it, but after the Statesman editorial, within 3 days it's discussed in Parliament, within 7 days there is a resolution, and within 2 weeks famine relief begins, which had not gone on for 9 months of people dying. Ultimately 3 million people died of that famine. And for those who are interested, by the way, Ian Stevens wrote a book called The Monsoon Morning, which is about his own experience in it. And he was quite proud of that. The only time I've written an obituary in the Statesman, in the Times in London, was when I read his obituary and didn't mention his role in the famine. So I sent a supplementary obituary, which the Times did publish. But by the time I went as an undergraduate in Cambridge, I knew that he was in King's. And I went to see him. I couldn't find him first, as his door was unlocked as I came in. But he was on his head, a habit he had picked up in India, doing yoga. He was in his head in one corner of the room, looking very much like a kind of ancient statue of some kind. So I got him down from there and upside up, and then we chatted. And then I think I must have had 6 or 7 dinners with him. Very proud of that period of his life. And actually, the odd thing, no, I'm making a mistake. There was the first person who mentioned to me him was Ian Foster, Morgan Foster. And we had, these meant to be secret, but no longer a secret. I had apostolic connections with Foster. And Foster said, I said, look, I would like to meet Ian Foster. Can you introduce me? And he said, I certainly can introduce you. I know him well. And he said, you know, he's not a friend of India. And what Morgan Foster meant is that after partition, the British civil servants divided themselves up into different camps. And he was in the Pakistani camp. Now, that mattered to me not at all. The lives that he saved were Hindus and Muslims all over Bengal. But that was and what happened, he went to Pakistan for a while. And then he felt very rebuffed because he hadn't quite recognized, he had this rather British view of this is a group of people who were less hostile to the empire, unlike the Hindu revolutionaries, which is not exactly true. And in fact, if one read even Foster's passage to India, Aziz is clearly a Muslim, but that was his belief. Then when he came back to England and then got a fellowship at King's, Ian Stevens was very disappointed with Pakistan, and he had forgotten the famine period. So for him, it was, I think, at least I took it that way, that he was very willing to talk with me about the famine. But what I learned, there were several things I learned. One is that press freedom has something to do with famine. Mm-hmm. I learned also that which I knew as a child, that you could have a famine with a lot of food around, and how the country is governed made a difference. The British did not want rebellion in Calcutta. I believe no one in Calcutta died in the famine. People died in Calcutta, but they were not of Calcutta. They came from there, from elsewhere, on grounds that whatever little charity there was came from Indian businessmen, but they were all in Calcutta. So they were coming into Calcutta, but there was not enough of that. But the Calcutta people were entirely protected. 3 million people had ration cards, which means about 6 million people were minimally being fed by the very subsidized price. And what the government did was to buy rice at whatever it would need in the rural areas, making the price shoot up, and then sell it at subsidized in Calcutta. And so the ration card holding Calcutta people had no particular reason for rioting, and that was the empire the large was concerned with. So there are lots of things I learned there. But I don't know whether you want to go on to the rights thing, but...
I want to, I mean, that in some ways is perhaps your most famous of what I think of as this long-running streak of empirical work that you've done from very early on. I mean, even from your thesis. Yeah. Sort of eschewing econometrics, but making a very good job of interpreting the data in ways that are enormously illuminating. But maybe we should go back.
But this is, I didn't use any economics because I didn't know any. And since I was, I was president of econometrics, which you are now, you know, something like that. Since I was there, and then people would say something, and I said, I don't know any econometrics. And they said, what are you president of the Econometric Society? I said, it's a profound mistake, because it's mathematical economics plus econometrics. Econometrics is connected with marshalling of information data and the kind of thing that Angus is so wonderful at. And I could have said, I do not do it if I wanted to be kind to myself, but I've said I cannot do it, which is true. And so there's this ambiguity, but I've done very little empirical work, but surely that
You've done a lot of very important empirical work, so that, and I mean, that book was one, I think, which, you know, many pure economists would claim as their own, in the sense of saying, you know, this is an economic problem. It's not a problem of not having enough food or something. And we have to think about the allocation of resources and entitlements and all that good stuff. But I want to bring you back. You talked about Arrow at the very beginning. And I want to come back to some of the more abstract thinking you've done. And then, for instance, your book, The Idea of Justice, which is, what, 10 years old now, something like that.
Yeah, it is exactly 10 years old.
You play off Arrow and Rawls, who was very important to you too, with Adam Smith in some sense. So you've got this, you know, Amartya Sen stirring the pot of Rawls and Arrow, and Adam Smith plays a big role in that book too.
Yeah.
Though presumably you never taught a course with him. But I mean,
I've tried.
You tried, yes, that's right. You know, when I grew up in Edinburgh, he was a very obscure figure. No one really paid much attention to Adam Smith, and that's really changed quite a lot in recent years.
When I arrived in Kirkcaldy to see his house, now there's something there, but I couldn't find his house. And then I went to there was a tourism center. I went to Kirkcaldy's tourism center, and I said, could you tell me where Adam Smith's house was? And they said, who is that you're talking about?
That's right.
And I said, well, why is Kirkcaldy famous for?
Linoleum is the answer.
Linoleum is the answer.
Much more than Adam Smith. But tell us a little bit about where you stand on those issues, because, I mean, in that book you're taking, you know, you're taking different position from Rawls, in that, you know, you can do things that Rawls could not do, like talk about global injustices in a way. You use some of Ken Arrow's framework to argue that, and you make great use of Smith's impartial spectator as a way of thinking about justice too. So maybe you could talk about some of those issues.
I know, it's absolutely. I mean, the Smith was, when I was in Presidency College in Calcutta, aside from the fact that Marx had a profound influence on me, and in his tiny way, in a particular way, as I mentioned Ken Galbraith, but the Ken Arrow, my formal work that I was already doing, was Ken Arrow. By the way, I ought to say something, since often I hear rather put down on Indian education. when I first arrived in Cambridge, and my first semester, my supervisor was Ken Verrill, and we had a complete non-meeting of mine because he thought that I ought to look at Samuelson, and I was quoting some bits, and it meant nothing to him. And then because he had asked me to read the introduction, and I was talking about the foundation of economic analysis, which was his more sophisticated book. And it was because in Calcutta I had done Foundation to Economic Analysis, and then arriving after 2 years of that in Cambridge, I was being relegated to introduction. And, but actually, Bale had a point, really, in the sense that he said, you have to read a very elementary book very carefully. I think that was a good advice. Mm-hmm. But Smith was a big figure already, nobody lectured on Smith in presidency. But I read first the Wealth of Nations, of course, and then the Moral Sentiment. And it had a kind of profound impact on me. Later, and this is an advertisement, there's a Moral Sentiment edition, which I see as mine, because I wrote a long introduction to it. That's the Penguin commemorative 250th anniversary of Moral Sentiment, published in 1759. And we managed to get it done in that year. I think it came out on the 29th of December that year, but we just made it. But there I discussed as to why there really had never been an economist like Smith, and there probably never will be. I think, and I'm so glad that Angus asked that question, I think the Ken era, there were these formal problems which interested me and didn't interest Smith. But there were basically human problems, including the title of this talk, which Tim chose about welfare, past, present, and future. That's what Smith was about. And also that he never used the word capitalism, not because it's not known. The term capitalism was being used by a number of his contemporaries, but not him. And I think he had a kind of real fear of classifying them, and are you pro-capitalist, anti-capitalist? I'm always asked this question. I say I don't even know what you mean by capitalism. You mean market economy, or you mean a market economy with a state and social safety nets and healthcare, or what do you mean? And so, but he was discussing how you have to think about the institutions put together, how they work. And there there's a passage where he's asking himself the question, this is the guru of the market economy, allegedly. He asks himself the question that why is it that we want sound political economy? Why is it important? People say because it will lead to, in his language, I'm not quoting that, high growth rate. That's basically what he's saying. High progress, whatever it is, high rate of progress. Why is that important? And he said, well, it's important for two reasons. First of all, it gives the individual more income, and that gives them, he doesn't use the word capability, but that's what he says he's talking about here again. I'm saying I've sometimes just thought about capability attributed to me. I'm not original in that either. I mean, that was also, that was said. And that it gives you the ability to choose the kind of life that you'd like to lead with affluence. And secondly, it gives the state more revenue, allowing the state to do those things which only the state can do well. And as an example, he talks about school education. So I think there was a kind of, I've never been, I have many faults, but I've not been, I think, dogmatic in terms of systems. Am I socialist, am I capitalist? Never answered that question. And that I think I got from Smith, in fact. The other thing I got from Smith was why Smith exaggerated a lot. But he exaggerated when he wanted to make a point. I'll give two examples of his exaggeration. One example is he's talking about slavery. And here, by the way, unlike David Hume, who showed some weakness on that, in fact had a passage. David Hume was non-xenophobic, and he had very high things to say about Asians, particularly Chinese, but also Indians and others. African, he was not so clear. And he, on one occasion, even said that he wasn't certain about equality on that. Now, you would not find not a single shred of that kind of thought by Smith. But he gets so upset about that, about how people write, he has to exaggerate. And he said that there is not a single African in the entire course from which slaves were recruited whose magnanimity falls short of that level of upliftment that his sordid master is completely unable to understand it. So he's not only saying that slaves were not inferior people, he's saying they're superior people to their bloody sordid masters. The other example I would give is the English attitude about the Irish. Going back to the fairy queen, and the Irish bring it upon themselves. And chief among them is their inclination to eat potato. And Smith has a section in the Wealth of Nations on the nutritional value of the potato, which when I was reading it, I wondered, what the hell is he going to go on to that? And then he says that, I know that in London, potato is often ridiculed as a food. But I ask you these questions. Who are the most powerful people you'll encounter in London? And then he says the most powerful people are the people that you will encounter who are porters who carry heavy bag in Paddington and elsewhere. And he said, without exception, they come from Ireland. And then he proceeds to say, and I thought he was getting onto dangerous territory, who are the most beautiful women you would encounter in London? Now, I don't know on the basis of what research. He comes to the conclusion that the prostitutes in Mayfair are the most beautiful women you will encounter. And then he says, without exception, they are from Ireland. Then he said, no further proof need be given on the nutritional value of the potato. Now, complete exaggeration, but totally to the point. Namely, that you hear one exaggeration, you hit it hard with an opposite exaggeration. So this I found it totally enchanting. I can give 4 or 5 other examples of this kind. But so basically, by the time I was I came on a boat, on a ship to England from Bombay, Stratnaver, 18 days, because I couldn't afford tourist class, economy class as it is now called, fare. And therefore I had to buy a ticket on a ship, which gave me 18 days bed, 18 days free meal. It gave me 18 days of free wine, which I hadn't started drinking yet, but was hoping to get onto that fairly soon. And that was cheaper. And I was reading also. Sometimes a little bit of topology, which I wanted to read more about, but sometimes Smith and others. And when I compared him with others that I could compare him with, I couldn't read Condorcet in English because there was not an available edition there that I could read. He could have competed. But I thought, the Smith remained, I could read the Theory of Moral Sentiment and really felt that I read something. And I think the Wealth of Nations. So I think you're absolutely right. So in some ways, the theory of justice, the structure, is Smith. Mm-hmm. And the technical problems come under Kenaro, and some of the philosophical complexities under Rawls. But what makes my understanding of justice cohere is Smith.
Yes, no. It's quite extraordinary. Can I'm a little mindful of time, but let me, when I first knew you, or I don't think you knew me, but when I knew you.
I knew you. You may have forgotten what our first conversation, but I can remind you.
Well, maybe afterwards, maybe over dinner. We Scots still exaggerate a lot, and I'm a little worried about what stories you might have to tell from there. But I do remember in Cambridge in 1969, the early 70s, there was very close contact between economists and philosophers. And there were tables in which people sat around and evening seminars and talks. And I know some of the philosophers who were there at that time and remember that too. And there looked like there was going to be this very close integration of welfare economics. Welfare economics had its problems. Graf's book was, 10 years old at that point. Ian Little's book. But, there was a lot of thriving discussion between economics and philosophy. And welfare economics seemed to have some chance of coming back. But if you look at where we are now, most economists, you go to top economics departments, there's no welfare economics taught at all.
No.
It's just completely vanished. And on the other hand, you've got practical philosophers who are doing economics without knowing any economics, which is a sort of disaster on the other side.
Yeah.
And economists have this sort of bastard idea of welfare economics or of human well-being, which is not thought out at all. And so, are you disappointed in this? When you started out, it looked like there would be a different future. And, what happened and what needs to be done now to get us back in a better place?
Yeah. I think the economist is ignoring philosophy in general, but welfare in particular, is a kind of gigantic folly that emerged. And I think the best article on that is Tony Atkinson.
Yeah.
What is the strange disappearance of welfare economics?
Yeah, pleading to bring it back into. It's one of the last pieces he wrote, and it sort of bemoans the loss of any sort of philosophical sophistication to, most economists wouldn't know what a utilitarianism meant. Even elementary stuff, it just vanished. And so that's certainly, he was bemoaning that.
Yeah, indeed. But but this period that you're talking about, when it was flourishing, as it were, it had a kind of seed of its own destruction, because the two most famous books, namely Graph, which you refer to, and Ian Little, were both essentially negative. I mean, Ian Little took us in the behavioral direction, and about you can make interpersonal comparison, but you're comparing behavior. It's never been clear to me, philosophically or common sense-wise, as to how can you compare interpersonal behavior and that gives you interpersonal comparison. It seems really far away. And Graph, of course, basically demolished the subject. Now, he demolished the subject in showing that all the assumptions made, and he was dealing with easy targets. I mean, someone who had to criticize compensation test. I mean, the basic. It's amazing that the compensation test had a life at all, and it's also further amazing somebody with such common sense, namely Nicky Caldor, proposed it, that if you can compensate those who have, this is for those who don't know, but it's a very easy idea to summarize in 13 seconds, that if some people gain and others lose, if the gainers have gained so much that they can compensate the losers and still retain some gain, then it's an improvement. And then you ask the question, do they actually compensate the losers? Oh, no, you don't have to do it. Well, I mean, what kind of an improvement is that? I mean, the Bengal famine might have been a compensation test victory because quite a lot of people were eating a lot more rice. But Hicks fell for it. And then I asked him, because I came to know him very well. I mean, that is, by the way, I ought to say that. I read some of Hicks in Calcutta. I thought The Value and Capital was a great book. And the moment I arrived in Cambridge, I was told by my guru that this is a terrible book. And you can see why I was being so resistant to John Robinson. By the way, I could say in a slightly different way about Lionel Robbins too. I think they were very unfair to him. But Hicks was one of the great glories of 20th century, I think. And then I came to know him. But there was an interesting thing. He put his name down. It's called sometimes Caldor-Hicks test. And then in one of his later books, I think called Essays in World Economics, I think, he says in the preface, for a little while, being deflected by some word he uses, like a welfare-minded friend, I went in a wrong direction, but I abandoned that position soon. No one name is mentioned, excepting if you look at index, it says Caldor N, page 13. So I think what they did was to show that most of nearly all of welfare economics didn't make sense, and you couldn't make any serious.
But before you go on from that, I mean, we're laughing about these compensation tests and how stupid they were, but they've totally infected American jurisprudence today.
And international trade theory too.
Yes, and the Supreme Court is applying compensation tests like that on a day-to-day basis.
I know.
And violating contracts is fine if the surplus is large enough.
Yeah.
But so this monster is still out there.
I know. But never underestimate the power of a bad idea.
Especially if you can express it in 3 seconds.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I, for a little while, persuaded by Jim Heckman. I was an advisory board of the American Bar Council. and talking about the rule of law. And the rule of law, it was quite fun, but the compensation thing, and when I asked saying, why do you use that? We said, no, economists have established that. So, and it's really absolutely terrifying.
But I'm glad you can laugh about it. But, you know, I mean, I'm surprised it doesn't make, well, first of all, it's a very serious matter. I mean, bad things are happening to people because of these bad ideas. But also, I mean, for you, I'm trying to get you to look sad or something and say, look, you know, you've had this magnificent career. You've done all these wonderful things. You've written things that have changed many people's lives. But the central enterprise of sort of bringing serious philosophy and welfare back into economics has not been a success in some sense.
No.
Yeah.
No, that's quite right. Nor bringing serious economics into philosophy.
Right.
The other way around also. Because, you know, there's a certain amount of economics that goes around, it's particularly in law and philosophy, and law and economics, and also in law and in the legal school, and where you hear about economic ideas. But yeah, I think there's a kind of balanced picture of failure and all around there. But the reason I was mentioning it is that one of the things that when I told Joan that I want to do welfare economics, she said that, have you not recognized that this is not deflated, this is a busted subject.
Yeah.
And you refer to graph and saying they're all trying to do it, and this is John verbatim. The cleverest of them all, maybe Jan Graf, showed that all this is nonsense. First of all, he didn't show it, and he himself never claimed it either.
No. Well, he gave up, right? He wrote this book and went back to his farm outside Cape Town and grew grapes for the rest of his life.
That's the story, you know, but he came and he was, he spent a year with me in All Souls College as visiting fellow. And he wrote a number of very interesting papers.
Okay.
There.
I didn't know
Yeah.
that. Tim, please.
I'd love to jump in at this point because
You ought to, yeah.
it reminds me of conversations you and I had. I can remember where we had them very early in my career, more than 30 years ago, where there is a triumph, I think, of welfare economics that we could approve of, which is the many things that have been done in the name of utilitarianism, many of which are things we should applaud. The 19th century reformers, very much influenced by Bentham. Yet you've, throughout your career, consistently been suspicious of the philosophical basis of utilitarianism. How can it be that something that apparently has done so much good in the world is philosophically suspect?
Well, faulty doesn't mean that it's valueless. I think I think the foundational problems of utilitarianism, I think, are recognized by utilitarians themselves, like John Stuart Mill, like not distinguishing between different sources of utility. Now, John Stuart Mill is a utilitarian, so there's some version of utilitarianism against which I have, with which I have less problem. But I think there is the point that John Rawls makes, that utilitarians don't take the difference between people,
Seriously.
the separation of people, sufficiently seriously. Somehow one person's gain could compensate another person's loss when you're going by aggregate. Now, you need not if you take, say, James Mead, he's in some sense utilitarian, but of course he's not summing things. And there are sophisticated utilitarians who take a different position. But it's not all that surprising that some theory with which one may disagree at a level of theory would do a lot of good. Yeah. And that is one of the historical, I give an example, which I don't accept, but if it were true, it would be a very good example, but you can see what. It's a Marx in India, who thinks that India was a great civilization, but had fallen very badly. And the only way of curing it is some influence that knocks it from outside, which the society is not able to generate. These are two articles he wrote for the Herald Tribune, 1850s, I think. And they were brilliant pieces. I think where it's mistaken is to assume that you need an empire to bring it from outside. If that were the case, the Japanese would not have grown. They would wait for, not for major restoration, but from some other country to take it over, but that's not the way to do it. So Marx is mistaken. But suppose Marx was right, then it would be right to say that imperialism is not a very good system, but my God, it did a hell of a lot of good for India.
Okay. Not everyone would, yeah, anyway. But can I come back to this period when welfare economics is in disarray,
yeah.
and you're, pushing alternative views, but it never stopped you doing this sort of applied welfare economics. I think in 1972 you wrote these guidelines on project evaluation.
Yes, I did.
Which was sort of very practical welfare economics, trying to do good for the world. Let's not worry too much about the philosophical underpinnings of it. I also remember you edited a book on economic growth. And I think I learned almost all I know about economic growth. I'm looking at Paul Romer sitting there, from reading the introduction that you wrote to that little volume. But that growth theory of the time was all tied up with the project evaluation. So it was sort of, okay, I'm really bothered by welfare economics, by utilitarianism, by Rawls and Arrow, but I'm going to go on and do good in the world by adding up incomes or something. Right?
Yeah. That's right. That is quite right. I guess that's a contradiction, really. But I both the growth economics as well as the guidelines, which began as a work with Stephen Margolin. He was a student. You came to Cambridge when?
69.
69, right?
Yeah.
So this is almost a decade before that. I was giving some lectures. I've just become a prize fellow, I think, in 20. And then there was this smart American sitting in the front row. And there was Stephen Margolin. And then he was working then on, you see, the Americans were kind of obsessed with water. And I think they may have been connected with California, I don't know, by the way, which is where he comes from. But there was a water project in Harvard going on. There were Arthur Mass and others working. And what I did was basically working with Steve to, I had to confess that I've never liked neoclassical economics, but I was a good neoclassical economist.
Right.
I could do it pretty well, which is a compliment that was paid to me by James Mead when he was giving principles lecture, and he used to hold class, and he asked me to jointly do it with him. And I said, James, that I'm skeptical of it. He said, I know it very well that you're skeptical of it, but you do it well. So I think and so in some ways, that is also a very neoclassical book.
Absolutely,
yeah. No, it's, well, I guess it adds to Tim's question that I'm not entirely being consistent in my life.
Well, it's also sort of part of what was really a planning literature in some sense. You know, you were in Calcutta when Mahalanobis was there, and the very early days of the Indian state, and he was, you know, writing the first plans for India and so on. You don't talk about that in your reminiscences of that period.
You know what?
You don't talk about Mahalanobis or the ISI.
No, actually,
or
that is a mistake. I did write a couple of papers on Mahalanobis, but I knew after when I read your novel, I forgot whether it was a bio or your lecture, but you are very, very generous to Mahalanobis, and he deserves it. And he did things that hadn't happened in India before. He was a professor of physics, and he left there, and he became chartered statistic, which was still a new thing. And then if you think of a whole lot of people who were trained entirely in the statistical institute, one of whom died last week, namely T.N. Srinivasan, but there were many others who were dead, and that was all Mahalanobis. Unfortunately, even T.N. and others didn't give him that much credit for it, which he should have got. You do. And, but I think, you know, I knew Mahalanobis as a child when I was 4. There are lots of pictures of me with, on Mahalanobis' shoulder being carried around, because he had a presence in where I was born, Shantiniketan, which was the place that Rabindranath Tagore had done. And oddly enough, this professor of physics, and about to be the inventor of sampling theory and so on, became he became Tagore's secretary. He spent 2 years there, and in that phase, I was a child, but I don't remember any conversation with him. But there's lots of pictures of me on his shoulder. And then later on, he had a favorite theme, which is the difference between subjective and objective utility, probability. And my problem there was that since I think the most important book on that subject is Keynes's Treatise on Probability. And in many ways, arguably, it's the best book he ever wrote. And the Mahalanobis' position was similar to that ultimately everything is subjective probability in some sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah, from frequency, you can't go to a probability without some intervention of the mind. But he was very keen on doing that. But the other thing he was keen on doing is to go ahead. And one of the penalties of it was that the early 5-year plans went ahead without education and healthcare. And that was a huge, huge mistake.
And were you worried about that at the time?
I did write something on that, but on the other hand, did I understand that I was making there was a mistake for that reason? I did to some extent, not because of any originality, but because of Smith. Because, I mean, as Smith emphasized again and again, that the most important expansion that you will get out will come from human productivity increase. Right. And education and healthcare is very important on that. So I did criticize Mahalanobis on that, but that was really Smith's thought applied to Mahalanobis as a critique.
It's very interesting.
Okay, there's probably one more question. I think we have time.
So all right, maybe this may be the last topic, but it may not. You've retained your Indian citizenship all your life.
Yeah.
You've never taken on any other citizenship, but some of us have. You've written, I think, that this preserved in some ways your standing to write and comment and think about Indian public affairs. You've written 2 wonderful books with my co-author, Jean Drez.
It's very easy to write excellent book with Jean Drez.
I know. Yeah. I mean, he writes the books. You
writes
get
the book.
the credit. It's terrific.
I've seen only one streak of meanness in him, because I went on saying, we have a very good division of labor. Jean does 99% of the work, and I get 99% of the credit. So on one occasion, to mistake, I said that Jean does 90% of the work, and I get 90% of the credit. So Jean looked at me and he said, "What happened to the other 9%?"
But all right. Jean is wonderful.
Yeah.
But we could talk a long time about Jean, but I don't really want to do that. I want to talk about the world in which many of us feel has taken a difficult turn in the last few years. And the India of today is surely not the India that you'd worked and hoped for much of your life, just as those of us who are living in America are deeply fearful of the liberal democracy in which we flourished for the last 50 years. I suspect it's a painful subject for you, but maybe you could talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, but you know, there's one big difference is that you can become British and American together. I can't become Indian and American together because India does not allow dual citizenship. And I tried to give a lecture to my Prime Minister friend named Imran. He said, you know, which are the countries we don't allow that? That's India, China, Russia, Japan. I mean, you know, is there a pattern there? I mean, why is it that India doesn't allow that to do it? Bangladesh does that. There's no problem. So there's that, but I didn't want to lose my Indian citizenship.
Right.
And to some extent, it has been made easier by the Queen, because of the fact that I would have felt very deprived if I couldn't, for example, vote in Brexit, which I did, because the voting in Britain doesn't go by citizenship, but by your being subject to the Queen. And India, since it opted to be in Commonwealth, though a republic, and has a president who is the highest authority in the country, but since it's a member of the Commonwealth, we're treated as subjects of the Queen. So I vote in British elections. I'm only now getting somewhat more involved in American elections, and there is no Queen here, there is a problem. But in Britain, that has been quite important for me. I've been a voter in almost every election that I've been in. I exercised because I lived 40 years of my 85 years in Britain. And so I have that sense, and right now I follow the Brexit news with the greatest of interest, which I think is one of the most disastrous things that sensible people can take, but they seem to be taking it.
So I think you're avoiding talking about Mr. Modi. Maybe
Mr. Modi,
we come back to
Mr. Modi is the best thing that I can say about him is that he's possibly about to lose the election. He had done something which actually even Trump would find difficult to see. I mean, India was a secular country, and to make it non-secular in a way, and people asking you whether you eat beef or not. Actually, by the way, it's also, if you're proud of Hinduism, there are a lot of really quite abstract, extraordinarily interesting ideas, even in the Vedas, you know, from 15th century BC. But to cotton on to the holiness of the cow is really, I mean, you couldn't really think lower than that. I'm sorry, I'm now going to be in all Indian trolls, because I get, every time I say anything like that, I get about 600 attacks. I mean, there's so many interesting things on Hinduism that that Modi could have gone for, and RSS and the Hindutva could have gone for, to go for things which are among the cruder aspects of the thought. It's really quite extraordinary, but it actually kills people. Of course, a number of people have been killed. Trump may expel journalists from meetings, but there are at least 4 journalists who have been killed for taking views which are disliked by the government.
But are you optimistic about the future? I mean, some of the things that scares some of us about Mr. Trump is that if Mr. Trump loses the next election, the forces that propelled Mr. Trump will not go away and will be still part of America. Do you think this is reversible in India? That we will get back?
Well, I think it's going to get quite a lot better. There's an article by James Taub in the New York Review, current number, which discusses how bad has been. And one reason why in India, this is India by the way, is that the institutional leadership has capitulated in a way that the American institutional leadership has not. And the blue wave that we are seeing, I believe we'll see something similar to that in the elections in December, in April in India. But meanwhile, nearly all vice chancellors are deeply prejudiced promoters of some Hindutva cause. You can get degrees on ancient Indian aviation and such things. Let me give an example. India had reason to be proud of having the oldest university in the world. Nalanda, started in 5th century. It had students coming from not only within India, but China, Japan, Korea, Thailand, and Indonesia, Sumatra, and so on. And it had a huge presence in the world. And it was nominally Buddhist institution, but it was Buddhist rather like the way Oxford University is Christian. So it allowed other things. One of the students, Yi Jing, wrote the first comparative study of Chinese and Indian medical systems, serious comparison of that. It's a 6-chapter book, but 2 of the chapters are on this subject. And it really had an enormous influence in the region, and it had the Indians had every reason to be proud of. Now then, the East Asian Summit, in a period of in a spirit of cordiality, suggested that they should revive it. The government of India said they would join that. I was asked, it was revived. I was asked to become the chancellor of that, which I resisted originally, but then I accepted. And then the government of India, it became clear that no money will come to Nalanda until the chancellor is changed. So I did a deal because George Yeo, who was the foreign minister of Singapore, who was with me in the board and usually acted as my deputy, I requested him whether he would take over, and after some pleading, he agreed, and he became the chancellor. They loved it because I was going away, but the moment he became chancellor, he wanted to choose his own vice-chancellor, then they said no. And then he kept on writing to them, saying, you have not replied to my letter. He didn't get any further reply. This is the foreign minister, former foreign minister of Singapore. And Singapore has contributed a fair amount of money for the library. So eventually he left also. And now he's been replaced by the chancellor, who is a great expert, I gather, on the byproducts of the medical and scientific value of byproducts of cows. And so if you want to say how to take what was the first 600 years earlier than Bologna. Nalanda was destroyed by an attack from the Middle East. Before Cambridge was born, just after Oxford was born. All that and the entire history of that education, which thanks to the Chinese students, not so much the Indian students, is very well written up because they wrote in detail as to what they found, why they went to Nalanda. Now that, this is like the rest of the university system. And you see that similarly the Indian Council of Cultural Relations, similarly Indian Historical, whatever it's called, Indian History something. They are all run by the government. They have been a total capitulation. In a way, America hasn't had, and Britain could not have had it. I don't think any West European country could have had it. Whether Hungary and Poland can now have it, I don't know. It's possible. But these are the real fears. So I think in the case of India, the elections are totally important as to how to bring it back to some kind of a sanity. So in America, I'm not that pessimistic, is because I think the American political culture has proved itself to be much more robust than India. Now, we are proud of the fact that India was the first non-Western country to become fully democratic. And if you go through the history, going back to the 6th century BC, first international consultative decision group. That was 6th century BC. The second was 5th century BC. The biggest was 3rd century BC. There's a long history of democracy. But as we have emerged from the British Empire, I don't think the institutions have the gravity and the strength that, say, Britain and America have.
Well, on that somber note, I think we have to close the discussion. You want to say?
Yeah, I think I'm going to call on Yor to for a vote of thanks at this point.
I will be brief with my vote of thanks. I'm just impressed. I loved what I heard, and for those of us who are in the academy doing all the, nitty-gritty, very narrow things, wasn't it just a great pleasure to see this broad sweep of economics? I mean, it just makes me love being in the academy and learning. And big round of applause, please, for our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much. And also Tim. Big round of applause for Tim, too, putting it all together, okay? I thank the team, DRI, Andrea, Kingsley, our RAs, students, Thanks Sibel in the Provost Office again, Davis the Savage and the Dean's Office, Social Sciences. Thank you all for coming here on a Saturday afternoon. And we're not quite done yet. There is some wonderful wine, fruit, cheese, and everything. We're going to be here for a little bit longer so we can all interact. And thank you, bless you, and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.